Hello and welcome to this podcast at The Wire. My name is Kabir Agarwal, and today we will be talking about the massive swarms of locusts that are attacking large parts of India. The swarms have entered India earlier than they usually do and have reached farther. For instance, they've reached Vidarbha in Maharashtra for the first time in almost 5 decades. They are capable of inflicting massive damage to crops and pose a threat to India's food security at a time when millions are already vulnerable to hunger. The large swarms of locusts also have a climate change link, scientists have said. To talk about the situation, we have with us Keith Cressman, who is the Senior Locust Forecasting Officer at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
How are you doing? Firstly, how are you coping with the COVID crisis in Rome?
Well, we now are slowly opening up after a very long lockdown of more than 2 months, and so we're hoping to safely resume some of our daily activities.
Right, and now, so coming to the locust crisis, how would you describe to those who've never seen a locust? How would you describe a locust and what it can do in very simple terms?
Well, I suppose one way is just to imagine that you're a farmer and you're growing some crops that rely on the rains in order for them to mature and that you can harvest. And these crops, of course, represent your livelihood. And so just kind of imagine you're out one day in your crops and you're checking them as usual, and you look towards the horizon and you see a cloud. And you're pretty happy about that because you need that rain, and this is what that cloud hopefully will bring some nice showers that are welcome to your farm. But as you kind of watch that cloud, you notice that it's moving towards you, and as it gets closer, you in fact realize that it's not a rain cloud, but it's a cloud of it's a moving cloud of some insects or something. And you probably then remember your grandparents, telling you really horrible stories back in the 1950s about locust plagues and clouds of locusts that block out the sun. And you probably, suddenly realize, hey, this is, what I'm seeing right now. It's a cloud of locusts. It's a locust swarm. And as you watch that cloud, descend and get closer to your crops, and then they come, through your field, and by the end of the morning, you don't have any crops left. And so, this is completely devastating. Of course, to your family, probably to your community that also relies on that food, and perhaps even for some of the food for next year, because this has been a good year with good rain. So often you grow extra foods that you can store for next year. But all of this, within half a day, has been completely lost.
So all the crop, you're saying that all the crop is lost. That we've heard a lot about how the appetite of locusts, particularly when they are in swamps, is voracious. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that? So what is their appetite like, and what happens to the crops?
Well, basically, locusts have the potential, of course, to eat all of the crops. Often they will not. They will just eat, a portion of those crops, but it could be enough, of course, to have a very negative impact on the yield, on the harvest. But locusts have different stages, of course, and the adults, they have what we call immature adults. So these are adults that aren't sexually mature enough to reproduce, and then of course there's those sexually mature adults, who are capable of reproduction. So it's the immature adult stage, which is, as you put it, the most voracious stage of the desert locust. I mean, you could kind of consider it to be like teenagers. You know how teenagers they kind of eat all the time. They don't really have set hours of eating. Whenever they see food, they empty out the refrigerator. Usually their parents get pretty upset at them. This is very similar to immature adult swarms. They're extremely voracious because their objective, of course, is to consume food, to get energy. Because often they either want to migrate, and so they need fuel in their tanks to do that, or they want to mature and then lay eggs. And then after they lay eggs, they've reached, the climax of their life, and it's over, and they die naturally. So for both these cases, for the migration and for reproduction, they need a lot of food. So this is why that immature stage is so voracious. Now, if we consider a swarm of locusts, and swarms can be different sizes. They might be less than a square kilometer. They could be hundreds of square kilometers. But let's just consider a 1 square kilometer of swarm. Now, inside that swarm, there's likely to be something between 40 to 80 million insects. Now, each locust is about as big as your index finger and weighs about 2 grams. So if you're really good at mathematics, you can calculate how much they're going to eat based on the fact that they eat every day their own weight in food. So
Wow.
a square kilometer of swarm, and let's just take 40 million. It'll take the lower number there. Uh, if you multiply that out, that's equivalent in the sense that that swarm, that 1 square kilometer swarm, in one single day, would eat the same amount of food as 35,000 people would in one day.
Okay, so that is why these swarms can be devastating for crops, for food security in parts of the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For instance, I live in Rome, Italy. So, if I imagine a swarm the size of Rome, and Rome is not a horribly big city, it's smaller than let's say, New Delhi in terms of area. So, I imagine a swarm the size of Rome. In one day, that swarm would eat the same amount of food as everybody living in Kenya, a country in
Wow,
Africa.
correct, correct. And so I've also been reading a little bit about this, and so one thing I found particularly interesting was that sometimes, I mean, there are the behavior of the locust changes. So often they prowl around individually, but something changes, and then they develop into swarms. They come together and develop these swarms. So what changes? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, this locus is very complex. It's kind of a Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll. It changes its behavior completely. It changes its appearance completely, in the sense that for hundreds of years, people thought these are two completely different insects. But in fact, about 100 years ago, a very famous Russian scientist worked out that this was just the same insect, but it was changing its behavior, its appearance in relation to environmental conditions. So normally, the desert locust is an individual insect, what we call solitarius. He's living a loner life. He's just alone in the desert, all by himself. He's not
And they
aware.
are mostly found in the Arabian Peninsula and African region, right?
Desert locust, as the name applies, is found in the deserts of the old world. So essentially, that is the deserts of North Africa, the Sahara Desert, the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, and of course, the deserts in Southwest Asia. So this means Rajasthan, in particular reference to India. They are common inhabitants of these desert areas. So when they're solitarious individuals, they're the same color as the desert. So the adults are brown, and the hoppers, the wingless nymphal stage, they're green, like the green vegetation. So they're camouflaged. And this is how they hide from their enemies or predators, and they stay safe. Now, when weather conditions become really favorable for locusts. So what does that mean? That means when there's warm temperatures, which is usually warm in the desert anyway, and there's rainfall. And it's usually rare to have rain in the desert. But when it rains, the locusts can take a very quick advantage of the situation. They quickly mature, and they can lay eggs that hatch after 2 weeks, and they increase in number, essentially about 20 times every 3 months. And this is exponential. So that means after 6 months, you don't have another 20 times, you have 400 times the number of locusts. So if the locusts can do this for a period of about 3 generations, 3 life cycles, and they would need, of course, good rains in the desert to do that, then they start to change their behavior because they start to concentrate. There's a lot of locusts around, and they start to come into contact with each other. So it's kind of like the opposite of social distancing for COVID-19. They're not following the regulations, are they? But they're coming close together, and that triggers chemical reactions inside of their body. They rub their hind legs together, which is the mechanism, and so inside, their hormones and their chemistry is changing, which we don't see, of course. But outside, we notice that they're starting to concentrate, they're starting to behave as part of a group, and in fact, we notice that they change their colors completely. So from this very boring brown color as an adult or green as a hopper, the adults now suddenly become very bright pink. The young, immature, the voracious stage becomes bright pink, and the mature adult becomes a bright yellow. The hoppers, on the other hand, they are kind of a bright yellow with black dots. So these very spectacular colors in nature, they serve a purpose, because when you have large concentrations of any animal or insect together, it becomes a target for any type of prey. Now, in the case of desert locusts, this can be birds, this can be lizards, might be snakes, maybe mongoose in India, for example. But when they're in such large numbers, they have to have a defense mechanism, something to protect them. So they use their coloration as a way to scare away the predators. Because birds and lizards and these guys, when they see something bright, they say, this is a sign of danger, or a sign of poisonous, or something is going to give me a stomach ache if I eat them. So yeah, I'm going to stay away from them. I'm not going to bother these locusts. And so then they're not affected by their natural prey and predators.
Okay. So one takeaway I found from there was that so they would need consistent rainfall in a desert region for them to multiply over 3 generations, like you said, to develop a sizable number, to create the kind of havoc that they are creating now.
Yes, indeed, and this is exactly what happened 2 years ago. Starting in May of 2018, there was a cyclone from the Indian Ocean that brought very heavy rains to the Arabian Peninsula, to a place what we call the empty quarter. And it's one of the most emptiest and remote areas on this planet. There's no inhabitations, no villages, no towns, no roads, no airports, no communications. There's just nothing there except for towering sand dunes. Sand dunes as tall as skyscrapers for as far as you can see. So it's an impenetrable area of the desert in the Arabian Peninsula. And it so happened that the cyclones brought some very heavy rains into that area. And they never get rain. It's a place that it might rain once every 50 years. So they had these heavy rains 2 years ago in May, and then 5 months later, they had another cyclone in the same area. So another batch of rainfall. So obviously, when you have a cyclone with such heavy rains, even just one cyclone is enough, for 2 generations of locust breeding. So here they had 2 cyclones. So, obviously enough to sustain more than 2 generations, probably 3 or even 4. What we know is that in that area, in the empty quarter, from May of 2018 until about March of 2019, of last year, that is, there were 3 generations of breeding. So there you go, the magic 3 generations of breeding, 8,000-fold increase of locust numbers in 9 months. And of course, once the vegetation dries out, and the locusts, what do? They form these massive swarms, and they start to migrate.
And so you're saying that the problem that we're facing right now has its genesis, has its roots in the cyclones of 2018.
Indeed, it did, because what happened after those cyclones, after that massive 8,000-fold increase in locusts, the swarms formed, and they left the empty quarter, and they went in 2 separate directions. First, a portion of them went southwards to Yemen, and then later on to the Horn of Africa. And another portion of them from the empty quarter, they went in the opposite direction. They went northwards they crossed the Persian Gulf, and they went to southern Iran. And there, last spring, 1 year ago from now, they had extensive flooding, heavy rains like the worst rains in 50 years type of thing in Iran. So the locusts were there to capitalize it, to take opportunity. There were several generations of breeding last spring, 2 generations to be specific. And again, at the end of the spring, before the summer, many swarms formed. And when swarms form in South Iran, in Southwest Pakistan, then they move, and they move east. They move east to India. So this is exactly what happened, is that last summer, India and also on the other side of the border in Pakistan, they received successive waves of swarms coming from Southwest Pakistan and from South Iran to into the desert areas of Rajasthan, Gujarat, and also in Pakistan, just at the same time when the monsoon rains arrive in those areas. So you can see that the timing of the locust cycle, of the winds, of the rains, it's all connected to ensure, that the locusts will survive.
And you mentioned what happened last year, and last year as well, I remember that a lot had been written about this, and it was said that this is the worst locust attack in India in about 2 decades. But we seem to have bettered that already, and we are in May. The monsoon is still about a few days, 15 odd days away. So why have the swarms come in earlier this year, and they have reached further than they have in the past? Why has that happened?
Well, first of all, it is, of course, linked to what happened last summer. So, if we continue the story, last summer, then in India, if you remember, the monsoon was very, very good. It was one of the best monsoons in a long time. And it lasted at least 1 month longer than normal in the locust breeding areas of Rajasthan. So, what this allowed was to have nearly 3 generations of breeding in the summer areas of Western India. And this is very unusual. Breeding started last May and it continued until this January. So, although substantive control operations were undertaken by the national authorities, by the Locust Warning Organization, as well as the state governments, still you can't you can't eradicate the locusts. They reduced the numbers, but still in the wintertime, there remained some populations. And because in January in Rajasthan the temperatures are cold, the locusts got a bit trapped. Normally they would all move back to South Iran, and a huge portion did. But some stayed in Rajasthan, some stayed in the Indus Valley of Pakistan, where they could remain and they could continue to breed, although slowly, but they remained there. So this is like a seed population, in fact, that was just kind of there waiting for this summer to arrive. Then, in addition, of course, you had very good breeding this past spring, the second year in a row now in South Iran and Southwest Pakistan, that again created swarms. And the first wave of those swarms now have come in to Western India from Pakistan because it's not so far away. Additional waves of swarms, of course, are to come next month, coming from further away from South Iran. All of these swarms, they first enter West Rajasthan, Jaisalmer area, Bikaner area, Barmer area, and usually that's where they stay. But because they entered this year early, ahead of the monsoon rains, they arrived in places that were dry. So what is the natural locust response to that? They look down at the ground, they say, hey, this is no good. I'm going to keep flying until I find better places to stay. I need shelter. I need food. So this is exactly what they did. We saw that they first arrived in West Rajasthan at the beginning of this month. Within the first 10 days, they were already moving towards East Rajasthan. In the last few days, they've continued. Some of those have continued into Madhya Pradesh, into the northern parts of Maharashtra. And of course, as you mentioned in the beginning of the program, these areas of central India, these states, they haven't seen a locust since the 1950s. So this is a rare event, but it's in response to the weather, to the dry weather that is still dry. The monsoon hasn't arrived yet. The winds that carried the locusts into the central states of northern India, uh, they were, of course, linked to the cyclone that just formed and that just brought very, very heavy rains and flooding to the eastern parts of India, to Orissa and those areas. So you can see, again, you can again see the link, between cyclones, between the weather, between rains, and between winds, and then of course the locust presence.
So you are saying that they are flying out away from Rajasthan into Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, etc., looking for favorable conditions, looking for moist weather, right? Looking for rain.
Exactly, and of course, they prefer to stay in the desert. They don't like really, these non-desert areas. They don't like the overgreen areas, the places that's full of vegetation. They like that sparse vegetation, so they have room to move. They have places to lay their eggs. So those locusts that come into the central states of northern India, they don't really want to be there. They're a victim of the wind. So what's going to happen now, between now and the beginning of the monsoon? And the monsoon is supposed to arrive in Rajasthan apparently about 1 week earlier than normal. So that's good news for the locusts. But still, they have about 4 weeks to do something with themselves. So they will be now again a victim of the winds. And as ahead of the monsoon, before the arrival of the monsoon, the wind is very extremely variable. Sometimes the wind is from the west, sometimes the wind is from the east, and so you'll have these surges of locusts that will be kind of moving back and forth across Madhya Pradesh mainly, and just kind of hanging out, waiting for that monsoon. In the end, most of those locusts, they will go back to Rajasthan because they know that that's the best place for them to be. That's, the desert, and that'll get some rain, and this is, paradise for them. They don't want to get into places like Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or Orissa. They don't want to get further south in India because it becomes too tropical, too humid, and then they pick up very easily diseases and they die off naturally.
Okay, so also considering that the swarm sizes this time have been exceptionally large. For example, there was a report today which said that the largest swarm is about 18 kilometers into 10 kilometers, which is massive. So how do you see this in the context? Have we seen larger swarms than these in the past?
Oh yes, yes. There's much larger swarms. I mean, in the past there's swarms that are as long as 70 kilometers. There's a a swarm. One single contiguous swarm was reported in January in northern Kenya, that was 40 kilometers long and 60 kilometers wide. So a swarm that's 10 kilometers is not massive yet.
Oh, okay. So they can be even bigger in size than this.
Yes, indeed, and obviously it depends on the locust numbers, and it depends on the concentrating factors, how the winds kind of concentrate the locusts into forming these large, massive swarms. But I would not be expecting that large, massive swarms will be coming into Rajasthan, nor crossing the northern part of India. Instead, it'll be more smaller size swarms. I mean, big, of course, to the common person, but swarms like you say, maybe 10 square kilometers, something like that, perhaps a bit bigger. But certainly they should not be massive swarms. No.
A recent press release from the FAO also said that the locusts are breeding 400 times more than usual. How do you see that? Why is that?
Right. That number again comes from the multiplication rate of each generation. So with each generation, it increases 20 times. So after 3 months, there's 20 more locusts. After 6 months, there's 400 times more locusts. So that's where that 400 times comes from. And so that means essentially 2 generations of breeding. And this is what has happened so far this year in East Africa, in Somalia, in Kenya, in Ethiopia. And this is what we've been saying since late last year, that during the first 6 months of 2020, there would be a 400 times increase in the numbers of locusts. Now, this is, of course, considering no control operations. So this would just be a natural increase. But as you know, of course, there's large-scale aerial control operations in progress. So they're not reaching their full potential of increasing by 400 times.
Okay. And so related question on control operations I had was that have control operations been hampered due to COVID and the restrictions imposed in different parts of the world due to COVID?
No, they've been hampered much less than you might imagine. And I'll tell you why. Mainly, COVID came to East Africa quite late, well after Europe, well after America, and everywhere else. And by the time it came to East Africa, and, the airports were shut and the flights were canceled and there was travel restrictions, we had already, FAO had already managed to get its international experts into the countries where they're needed to help organize the control operations and for training and logistics and these things. So they were already there before everything closed down. In addition, FAO also organized with the countries to bring in additional aircraft for the aerial control operations, as well as sprayers and other equipment, including pesticide. So most of these deliveries had been made. All the aircraft had arrived, and nearly all the equipment, and most of the pesticide. So fortunately, that was not impacted by the COVID. Now, of course, during control operations, pesticides are consumed and fuel as well. So more deliveries have to take place. So the current deliveries are delayed somewhat by the COVID-19, but it doesn't mean that the control operations have ground to a halt. They have not ceased. Those planes are still flying because they have sufficient stocks of what they need. In terms of the internal travel restrictions, the governments of these countries, and this is also similar to India, they understand the threat and the danger of the desert locust situation, and so they have declared that everybody who is involved in the monitoring and the control operations, they are exempt from these travel restrictions. They have waivers, and so they are considered as essential services, much like the security and the medical services of any country. So this is excellent news. In fact, they're not constrained by that at all. In terms of social distancing, yes, of course, when a country like Kenya, is invaded by locust swarms, they're not used to locust swarms. They get them twice in 70 years. They have no experience. They have no knowledge. So there's an awful lot of on-the-job training that is carried out in parallel with those control operations. So with the social,
just to follow up question there, in non-COVID times, a team from the FAO would perhaps from somewhere else, some other country would have gone to Kenya.
When there's a locust emergency, yes. When a country requests expertise from the outside, then of course we can bring in expertise to help the country if they don't have the national capacity to do so. India is a different story. India has it has the world's oldest locust program, so they have incredibly good capacity. So obviously, this type of request we don't receive from their government.
No, I was asking about Kenya, since you said that this is the second locust attack that they are seeing in 70 years. So had the travel restrictions not been in place, ideally a team from somewhere else would have gone to help out Kenya, right, to come to terms with the situation, since they don't have the experience of dealing with the situation.
Yes, but the team already went to Kenya before the travel restrictions.
Okay. So that had happened already before the travel restrictions came into place. So there was some reports also coming in of the control operations which involve spraying of pesticides, perhaps not having been done as they would have been in a normal situation in Iran and Pakistan. Is there anything to that?
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
I was saying that there have been certain reports which have said that control operations in Iran and Pakistan were not up to scratch leading up to the situation in March and in April due to the COVID outbreak. Do you see, is there anything to that?
No, we haven't heard any problems with those control operations of not being up to scratch because of COVID-19. The control operations, have not been impacted as far as we know by any of the COVID-19 restrictions.
Okay. And would you also explain a little bit what control operations involve and what are the most effective control measures to deal with this situation?
Yes, control operations involves precision spraying. So what this means is that this is spraying either chemical pesticides or biological pesticides directly on the locust. You can't spray the pastures, you can't spray the environment or crops or farms. It has to be sprayed directly on the locust, and within 24 hours, those pesticides, they break down, they're no longer effective, and they're no longer a poison, let's say. So what this means, of course, is that because of the precision needed, farmers are not in a position to be spraying desert locusts. This has to be carried out by the state or by the national authorities. And also, these authorities are very well trained. And that's important because you have to use the correct methodology. Otherwise, you're just wasting pesticide and you don't get a good result. So this is expensive and it can be damaging to the environment.
Okay, so and does the do the wind patterns also matter a lot? How effective is spraying these pesticides from using drones, which is something that India is now exploring?
Yes, of course. The way desert locust control is carried out is that it relies on the wind to get that pesticide to the insect to the locust. So that's why it's very important to understand how the wind works and how the pesticide works. So you make sure that the pesticide goes where you want it to go. Now, in the case of using drones, this is a very new technology. Nobody's really tried it out. We don't have the precise standard operating procedures on how to do that effectively so that we get very good results. And also, drones are very small. They have a very limited capacity to hold pesticides. So they will only be able to spray very short, very small distances and areas. And of course, there's a problem with the battery life. The batteries don't last very long. So still, sprayers that are on the back of vehicles or aircraft sprayers, they will cover much larger areas.
Okay, so you don't see the drones like it's an experiment which might work, might not work.
Yes, exactly. Drones, might be useful in those places where you can't reach the locust by the ground, from handheld sprayers or vehicle-mounted sprayers, or in areas that are too small to treat by aircraft. In other words, like when they land on treetops, for example, sometimes, locusts get on the tops of trees. They're very hard to spray from the bottom of the trees. So if you had a drone in that case, that could, be quite interesting as a way to try to treat the locusts.
Okay, and just in the context of food security in India, we are going through an unprecedented crisis due to the restrictions imposed due to COVID and the disease itself, and we are seeing widespread hunger already. Millions are already vulnerable to hunger in India, and what has come in handy for us right now is our buffer stock of food grains. We have a lot of food grains because of bumper crops in the last few years. And so, do you see that the locust swarms could pose a threat to India's food security?
I think what is probably easier to understand is that, of course, these locust swarms, they always pose a threat to crops and to pastures. And these crops and pastures, people rely on them for their food, for their livelihoods. So, the locust swarms in India are no different than those in East Africa, where there's an unprecedented threat in East Africa from those swarms on food security and livelihood. And I would imagine that there's also the locust swarms as well in India threaten the food security and the livelihood. Much depends, of course, on the growing season this year. So what is the timing of the swarms? What is the timing of the rainfall? How good are the conditions, not only for the locusts, but for growing the crops?
But also you were saying that a good monsoon would also be good for the locusts, and which would be bad for the crops.
Well, yeah. This is the ironic thing about it. Good rains are good for farmers because of their crops, but it's also good for the locusts. So as we say, when it rains, it pours. So in the dry years, there's not so many locusts, but then there's not enough rain for the crops as well.
So good monsoon is good for locusts, good for crops, but good for locusts will be bad for crops.
Yes, exactly. So this is why it comes back to the importance of those control operations.
Right. But you also said that when it does rain in Rajasthan, they would prefer to go back to Rajasthan. Right. So that mean that it would not pose such a big threat in the rest of the country?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it then should be restricted to the Rajasthan area. We're not anticipating that just because some of the swarms arrived early in the country and have moved in the central states. We're not anticipating that they would remain in the central states and breed and increase there. No, they should go back to the desert areas where they would then spend the summer period there until October, November at least.
And lastly, I had a question about in an interview you gave to Down to Earth. I think it was in February this year. You spoke about the locusts staying on in India through the winter, and you said that this is very, very unusual. How would you describe the situation now? How does the situation this year weigh up against the situation last year?
I think the situation this year is very similar to that of last year. This year we have much more and better early warning. Last year I think it caught many people by surprise, but this year we knew that this situation was going to develop. I remember being in India in January of this year, meeting with the government officials in Delhi as well as the state officials in Rajasthan, warning them already in January of this possibility of having the risk of not only the swarm invasion from the spring breeding areas of Pakistan and Iran, but in addition this year having that extra swarm invasion threat from the Horn of Africa. So far, obviously the first threat has materialized. The second one is still too early. That will be probably later in June or early July. But what is most surprising, I think, is that how quickly some of the areas in the spring breeding areas dried out, and this is why those swarms have moved early and they've gotten into Rajasthan well in advance of the monsoons. That's a bit unfortunate. It would have been much better, of course, if those spring breeding areas would have stayed green for another month or so to hold those locusts there. And then, by the time they move into Rajasthan, they would be just at the same time of the monsoon, and they would not have any need to move into East Rajasthan or onto the central states in northern India.
Okay. And finally, do you see that this being sort of a yearly threat now due to climate change? And as you mentioned, the rainfall in the desert regions of parts of Africa, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula are the root causes of this problem. And that is likely, those areas are likely to receive more rainfall now due to climate change. So do you see that this being a perennial yearly threat in these parts of the world?
Yes, of course, it is a perennial threat in the desert areas from West Africa to Rajasthan. And in response to this perennial threat, these countries, they have national locust programs. So this is their job, is to monitor the situation in their deserts, of course, and to take the necessary control operations. And that's exactly what India does every year. In fact, they have massive amounts of monitoring going on from basically from June till about November. And then they do control operations. And India's been doing this, for the past about 70 years or so, if not longer. Now, what because of the current situation, I think of this year, it is a bit of a wake-up call for the governments, especially in those countries that don't have national locust programs. The governments are starting to consider how they could develop one, such as one in Kenya, that could respond to locust invasions, but then could also somehow survive, long periods when there's no locusts. Fortunately, India, doesn't have this problem, but still, the frontline countries, those countries that have locusts every year, the current situation, is very good in a sense that the authorities are now reviewing their national programs and looking very seriously to see, how can they expand them, how can they modernize them, how can they improve them, because as you say, if climate change is actually going to continue to cause more cyclones and more locust upsurges, the countries will need to be prepared in order to respond effectively and on time.
Okay, on that note, we'll end this conversation here. Thanks a lot, Keith, for joining us and for explaining this very complex, multi-layered issue to all of us. Thanks a lot.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for having me.